A cop sits in a fancy restaurant enjoying his meal until he notices a black woman sitting a few tables away. He smirks, makes a rude comment loud enough for everyone to hear. He thinks he's being clever, he thinks he's untouchable. But minutes later his face turns pale, his hands shake. And what happens next? It leaves him frozen in place. What he said will shock you. But what happens next, even worse for him, before we dive and tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end, you won't believe how this one ends. It happened at a fancy restaurant, the kind of place where the food costs more than a normal person's paycheck. Soft music played, candles flickered, and the waiters walked around in crisp suits. At one table sat Officer Mark Davidson, middle-aged, loud, and full of himself. He leaned back in his chair, laughing with his colleagues. He spoke just a little too loudly. He wanted everyone to hear him. A few tables away sat Dr. Olivia Bennett, calm, elegant, a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't here to impress anyone, she just wanted to enjoy her meal. But Mark noticed her, and he didn't like what he saw. He smirked and muttered under his breath, "Didn't know this place had it a diversity program." His colleagues chuckled, but one of them shifted uncomfortably. "Mark, don't start." Mark just laughed. "What I'm just saying, you don't usually see people like her in a place like this." Olivia heard every word. She didn't react. Not because she didn't care, but because this wasn't new. She had spent her whole life dealing with men like Mark, but that didn't stop him. He leaned back and shook his head. "Bet she's just here for the pictures, got to show off for Instagram, right?" The waiter near Olivia's table froze for a second. Other diners exchanged glances. People were starting to notice. But Olivia, she just took another sip of her wine. She didn't need to respond, because in just a few minutes Mark was about to embarrass himself. In front of everyone, Mark Davidson leaned back in his chair, smirking as he watched Olivia from across the restaurant. He had already made a few snide remarks under his breath, but now he was feeling bold. "She probably got lucky with some scholarship," he muttered loud enough for his colleagues to hear. "Or maybe she's with some rich guy who actually belongs here." One of his colleagues, Eric, shifted uncomfortably. "Mark, let it go, man. You don't even know her." Mark laughed. "I don't need to. I know the type." He took a sip of his drink and leaned in. "Bet she's here for the pictures, got to show off her Instagram." Right across the room, Olivia set her fork down. She had been silent the entire time, ignoring him, but now she glanced up and locked eyes with him. Her expression didn't change. No anger, no surprise, just calm, measured control. "Something funny, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth and steady. Mark raised an eyebrow, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Oh, so you do talk," he said. "Didn't think you'd want to draw attention to yourself." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "And why is that?" Mark shrugged, still smirking. "Because you don't exactly fit in here, sweetheart. Just being honest." His table chuckled, but the laughter was weaker this time. The atmosphere had shifted. A few diners at nearby tables exchanged glances. The waiter, who had been standing near Olivia's table, suddenly looked uncomfortable. Olivia gave a small smile, unimpressed. "Honest?" she repeated. "That's an interesting word choice." Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." She nodded, taking a slow sip of her wine. "That's funny. I was thinking something completely different." Mark's smirk widened. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" Olivia placed her napkin on the table and folded her hands. "I was just wondering how long it'll take before you realize the mistake you just made." Mark's smirk faltered slightly. There was something in her tone, calm, confident, unshaken. It made him uncomfortable, though he wasn't sure why. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked. Olivia didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the restaurant entrance. At that moment, a well-dressed man in a suit walked in. He scanned the room briefly before his eyes landed on Olivia. Without hesitation, he made his way directly to her table. Mark's smirk vanished completely. His eyes flickered between Olivia and the approaching man, trying to make sense of it. The man arrived at Olivia's table and smiled warmly. "Sorry, I'm late." Olivia. Mark stiffened. Olivia, first name basis. He hadn't expected that. Olivia smiled back. "No worries, you're right on time." The man pulled out a chair and sat beside her. Immediately, the energy in the restaurant changed. The waiter, who had previously been hesitant, now straightened his posture and quickly approached the table. Other guests, who had been watching the interaction, suddenly seemed more aware of what was happening. Mark exchanged glances with his colleagues. Something was off. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice casual. "So, who's your friend?" The man turned his gaze toward Mark, his expression unreadable. "I don't believe we've met," he said, his voice steady. Mark straightened in his seat, suddenly feeling the need to sound more polite. "Officer Mark Davidson." "And you are?" The man's lips curved slightly, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Olivia. "Did I miss something?" Olivia placed her hands on the table, still perfectly composed. "Not much, just a bit of ignorance on display." Mark's face flushed red. His confidence wavered. His colleagues suddenly found their plates very interesting, pretending they weren't involved. Before Mark could think of a response, the restaurant manager appeared, looking nervous. He walked straight to Olivia's table, his posture stiff and formal. Dr. Bennett, my deepest apologies. We had no idea you were dining with us tonight. Silence. Dr. Mark blinked, the words not making sense. At first his mind scrambled to process what he had just heard. The manager then turned to the suited man and added, and Senator, welcome. If there's anything you need, just let us know. Mark felt his stomach drop. His grip tightened on his drink. Senator, the man sitting next to Olivia wasn't just someone wealthy. He was a U.S. senator, and Olivia was Dr. Olivia Bennett. Not a social climber, not an Instagram influencer, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. Mark's throat felt tight, his hands suddenly felt clammy. The restaurant was completely silent now. Every nearby table had stopped pretending not to listen. People were watching, whispering. Mark could feel the eyes on him. His face burned with humiliation, his heart pounded. He had just publicly insulted a woman who had the power to destroy him with a single phone call. He opened his mouth to say something, anything. But for the first time that night, he had no words. Olivia leaned forward, slightly resting her chin on her hand. Still think, I don't belong here. Mark's jaw clenched. He wanted to say something, but what could he say? He had spent the last 30 minutes running his mouth, and now he realized he had been completely blind to who he was dealing with. The senator, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. His tone was calm, but carried a quiet authority. Do you know who you just insulted? Mark swallowed hard. I didn't mean. The senator shook his head. I'm not interested in excuses. Mark's body felt frozen. He spent years getting away with these kinds of comments. A joke here, a smug remark there. He had never thought twice about it, but now he had been caught, and in just a few minutes his entire world was about to crumble. Mark Davidson sat frozen, his usual smug confidence completely gone. The air in the restaurant felt heavier, the weight of his mistake pressed down on him as he replayed everything he had said. He had spent the night mocking Olivia, assuming she didn't belong here. But now he was the one who didn't belong. The senator leaned forward, slightly, his expression unreadable. Do you have any idea who you just insulted? Mark tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, his palms felt sweaty. Look, the senator didn't let him finish. Dr. Olivia Bennett isn't just another woman having dinner. She's one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. She's argued cases that have changed lives. She stood against corruption. And tonight you decided to humiliate her for your own entertainment. Mark's stomach twisted. He had heard that name before, but in his arrogance he hadn't connected the dots. I didn't mean anything by it, Mark muttered. It was just a joke. Olivia finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. A joke? You think this was funny? Mark looked at her, hoping for even a little sympathy. But her expression didn't soften. It wasn't personal. He said quickly, I didn't even know who you were. That's the problem, Olivia said, leaning forward slightly. You didn't know. But that didn't stop you from assuming, did it? You assumed I didn't belong here. You assumed I was beneath you, and now you want to backtrack. Because you realize who I am. Mark clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of every eye in the restaurant on him. His own colleagues sat in silence, watching, unwilling to come to his defense. The senator sighed, shaking his head. Officer, let me ask you something. If you had recognized Olivia's name when you first saw her, would you have treated her differently? Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. He knew the truth. Everyone in that room knew the truth. Of course, you would have, Olivia said, because this isn't about respect, it's about power. You don't treat everyone with dignity. You treat people based on what you think they're worth. Mark's face burned. That's not true, he snapped. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Really? Then tell me, when was the last time you made a joke like that about a white man in a suit? Mark had no response. The senator leaned back in his chair. This is what's wrong with people like you. You don't even realize the harm, because you walk around with your badge thinking it gives you the right to judge people before you even know them. Mark's heart pounded. He felt like he was drowning. He needed to get out of there. But he also knew this conversation wasn't over. I messed up, he admitted. His voice was quieter. Now he barely believed his own words. Olivia studied him for a moment. Are you sorry because you actually understand what you did, or are you just sorry because you got caught? Mark's stomach turned. He wasn't even sure of the answer himself. The restaurant manager, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward nervously. Dr. Bennett. Senator, would you like us to escort him out? Olivia shook her head. That won't be necessary. She turned back to Mark, giving him one last look. But you should probably leave before you embarrass yourself any further. Mark hesitated. Every instinct told him to push back, to defend himself, to find some way out of this. But deep down he knew there was no saving face here. He had been exposed. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and stood. The room was silent. His colleagues didn't speak. The diners around him watched, some shaking their heads, others recording. And as he walked away, he knew this wasn't the end. This moment would follow him. And for the first time he wondered if he truly deserved it. Mark Davidson walked out of that restaurant, his face burning, his chest tight. He had spent the entire evening feeling like he was in control, like he could say whatever he wanted without consequences. But now he realized he had been wrong the moment he stepped outside his phone, buzzed a message, then another. He frowned, pulled it out, and saw a flood of notifications. His name was already on social media, his words, his smug laughter, the way he mocked Olivia. It had all been caught on camera. He clicked on one of the videos. The caption hit him like a punch to the gut. Racist cop insults civil rights attorney. Watch what happens next. His hands shook as he scrolled through the comments. This guy's a cop. No wonder people don't trust the system. Imagine how he treats people on the streets if this is how he acts. In public, karma just handed him what he deserved. Mark's stomach twisted. His entire career could be over. He rushed to his car, his mind spinning. He had to fix this. He had to explain. It was just a misunderstanding, right? He could clear this up. But deep down a voice whispered, could he really talk his way out of this? Or was this the moment where he had to finally face the truth? Because for the first time, he wasn't the one with power, and he hated it. By the time he got home, the damage was worse. His name was trending. His department had already released a statement. We do not tolerate discriminatory behavior among our officers. The matter is under review. He dropped his phone onto the table and gripped his head. This was bad. A few hours later, his phone rang. He grabbed it, hoping it was someone who could help. It wasn't. It was his captain, Mark. The voice on the other end was cold. We need you at the station now. Mark exhaled. Slowly, he didn't ask why. He already knew when he arrived. The captain didn't waste time. Sit, Mark said. The captain slid a folder across the desk. You know what's in here? Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. The captain leaned back. You embarrassed this department. You embarrassed yourself. And worst of all, you proved exactly what people already think about cops like you. Mark clenched his jaw. It wasn't like that. The captain raised an eyebrow. Wasn't it? He tapped the folder. Tell me, Officer Davidson, if that had been a white woman sitting at that table, would you have said anything at all? Mark opened his mouth, closed it, because the truth was sitting there heavy in the air. He couldn't lie his way out of this. The captain said, you've got two choices. One, we push this forward, and you fight for your job in a hearing that, let's be honest, you're going to lose, or two, you take some time off, reflect, figure out who the hell you want to be. Mark swallowed hard. And if I don't want to do either? The captain didn't blink. Then you're done. Silence stretched between them for years. Mark had walked into every room thinking he was untouchable, that no matter what he'd always have the upper hand. Now he was realizing that world didn't exist anymore. And for the first time, he wasn't sure who he was without it. Mark sat in his car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of what had happened in the last 24 hours sat heavy on his chest. He had walked into that restaurant thinking he was in control, that he could say whatever he wanted and walk away without consequences. But now his name was everywhere. His actions were being dissected online in news reports, and in the very department he once thought would always protect him. His phone buzzed again. Another headline, another wave of messages. Race cop insults black woman, finds out she could end his career. Officer Mark Davidson faces backlash after public confrontation. Civil rights attorney Olivia Bennett responds to viral incident. He exhaled, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, he didn't recognize the man looking back at him inside the station. Things had only gotten worse. His captain made it clear he wasn't suspended, not yet, but his job was hanging by a thread. The department was investigating his conduct, and public pressure was mounting. His colleagues weren't defending him. They weren't patting him on the back or laughing like they usually did when he cracked one of his jokes. Instead, they avoided eye contact, some of them shaking their heads, others whispering behind his back. The shift had already begun. He wasn't the guy people respected anymore. He was the guy they didn't want to be seen with. Mark could feel the walls closing. In this wasn't just about one bad night. This was about every offhand comment, every assumption he had ever made about people who didn't look like him, every moment where he thought respect was something only certain people deserved. And now he was finally on the other side. For years, he had believed that people like Olivia were just overreacting, that people played the race card too often, that social media blew things out of proportion. But now he was the one under the spotlight. Now he understood that once the world sees you a certain way, there's no taking it back. But the real question was, did he even deserve to take it back? The next morning, he didn't show up at work. Instead, he found himself sitting outside an office building he never imagined, walking into Bennett and Associates civil rights law firm. His palms were sweaty, his chest was tight. This was stupid, wasn't it? What was he even doing here? Still, he got out of the car and walked in. The receptionist glanced up and immediately recognized him. Her expression gave nothing away, but he could feel the tension in the air. Everyone in this building knew who he was. They had all seen the video. She picked up the phone, murmured something, then nodded toward the hallway. She'll see you now. Mark's stomach turned as he walked toward Olivia's office. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe that she'd refuse to talk to him. Maybe she'd laugh in his face. But when he stepped inside, she was just sitting there, calm as ever. She had been waiting for him. I'm not here to argue, Mark said quickly. I need to understand. Olivia leaned back, slightly studying Him understand what Mark hesitated, then let out a slow breath. How people like me end up this way. She didn't blink. People like you. Mark rubbed his temples. I didn't think I was racist. I still don't think I am. But after last night, after everything that's happened, I don't know anymore. Olivia nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she gestured toward the chair across from her sit. He did for the next hour. Olivia spoke. She didn't yell. She didn't mock him. She didn't talk down to him. She just laid out the facts. She told him about the history. He had never been forced to learn about the patterns of discrimination in law enforcement, not just in the big cases that made headlines, but in the small, everyday interactions, the ones that added up over time. She told him about people like her father, a decorated war veteran, who was still treated like a second-class citizen when he came home, about the time she had been followed in stores, questioned at events, treated as if she didn't belong. And as Mark sat there listening, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Shame, not because he had been caught, not because his job was on the line, but because for the first time he saw himself through someone else's eyes. By the time Olivia finished, Mark's head was spinning. He had always thought of racism as something big, something obvious, slurs, violence, people in white hoods. But now he saw it was something else too. It was the way he had looked at Olivia that night, the way he assumed things about her before she even spoke. It was in the way he had laughed when he thought she was beneath him, and panicked when he realized she wasn't. It was in the way he had lived his life, never having to think about any of this. He cleared his throat, staring at the desk. I don't know how to fix this. Olivia tilted her head. Do you want to? Mark frowned, looking up. What do you mean, do you want to fix yourself, or do you just want to fix your reputation? Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out because he wasn't sure. Olivia exhaled and reached for a folder on her desk. She slid it across to him. You have two choices. You can keep making excuses, go back to your life, and wait for the next scandal to take the heat off of you. Or you can do something different. Mark looked down at the folder. Inside were names, programs, books, and training sessions, resources meant to help people like him understand why this wasn't just about one night at a restaurant. He swallowed hard. This isn't going to change people's opinions of me. No, Olivia said simply. But maybe it'll change you. Mark nodded slowly. He had spent his whole life thinking he had all the answers, that he was on the right side of things. But now he realized he had spent his whole life not asking the right questions. He stood up, gripping the folder tightly. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if he could truly change. But for the first time, he knew he had to try. Mark walked out of Olivia's office, the folder still clutched in his hand. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. He'd spent years thinking he understood the world. But now he wasn't so sure anymore. This wasn't just about losing his job. It wasn't just about one bad night. It was about who he had been this entire time. The truth. He had a choice to make. He could ignore everything, walk away, pretend none of this mattered, or he could face it, learn change. But real change wouldn't come easy. It wouldn't come with one conversation, one apology, one good deed. It would take work, and maybe for the first time he was ready to do that work. But here's the real question. Do you think people like Mark deserve a second chance? Can someone truly change, or do actions like his define a person forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter, because conversations like this, they need to happen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.